Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to talk about the Viennese composer Anton Webern, who was one of the most important students of Arnold Schoenberg. We will look at one of his works for string quartet, in which he moved towards a new, very concentrated, intensely expressive and simultaneously extremely delicate musical language. I will first talk a bit about Webern, his influences and his musical evolution. Then I'm going to present the work I chose, the 5 movements for string quartet opus 5. And finally we're going to look at movement 4 in detail. Please like and subscribe if you like what I do. So Anton Webern was an Austrian composer, a very Austrian composer. In fact, he loved his home country very much, most of all its magnificent nature and of course its culture. He was steeped in Austrian and Germanic culture, and the large majority of art he knew and felt close to was from that culture. Webern was born in Vienna and is part of what is known as the Viennese or the Second Viennese School, the other members being Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg. When referring to this group as the Second Viennese School, one implies that there was a First Viennese School, and meant are the great classical composers Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven. But this designation is not really accurate, as many musicologists have already stated. Not only were none of these composers actually Viennese, but Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven never formed what can be called a school. In contrary to that, Schoenberg, Berg and Webern were all Viennese, although they had an ambivalent relationship to the city, and Webern lived mostly in the provincial area around it, which he preferred. In addition to that, there was an actual school that revolved around Schoenberg, who was an important and influential teacher. Even at the time, the group of Schoenberg and his students was known as the Schoenberg-Schule. He was a great composition teacher and had hundreds of students, but nowadays we refer to the Viennese school as the trio of Schoenberg and his 2 most talented and influential students, Berg and Webern. Schoenberg's composition teaching was built upon the Germanic musical tradition, which he knew deeply. Before focusing on own pieces, the students needed to learn the basics of Western music, so harmony and counterpoint. With that came lots of analysis of the usual composers, Bach, Mozart, a lot of Beethoven, Schubert and so on. Schoenberg always tried to push his students to write very personal music that only they as individuals could and needed to write. But of course, him being a huge role model, a real master to his students, influenced their own music, and they would often follow the directions he was taking in his work. Webern became Schoenberg's student in 1904 while still studying musicology at university, specializing in the music of the 15th and 16th century Franco-Flemish composers. He took lessons with Schoenberg until 1908, but their relationship would last much longer. Webern was probably Schoenberg's favorite student, and Schoenberg was a real father and master figure to Webern. He admired, idolized and really venerated him in every way, maybe even a little bit too much. It was really hard for him when Schoenberg moved to another city, for example. When Schoenberg moved to Berlin, it was so insufferable for Webern that he followed him and moved directly next to him. Like Schoenberg and his friend and colleague Alban Berg, Webern started out writing very passionate late romantic music. These romantic works are all without opus numbers, so unofficial works, so to say. Among them are many lyrical songs and music for string quartet. For example, his beautiful slow movement for string quartet. Another one is the String Quartet 1905, in which one can clearly hear the influence of Schönberg's music and in which Webern actually already made the step into atonality, that is, music without a tonal center. His first opus number is the Passacaglia Opus 1, for which Schönberg acknowledged that Webern had learned the craftsmanship of composition. It was also one of the last works that Webern composed as a student of Schönberg. This work is a dramatic orchestra piece that could be the 13th Symphony of Mahler or something. Its form is carefully constructed, the counterpoint is very complex and the motivic work very elaborated. Already in the Passacaglia you can see that the principle of variation was very important to Webern. The same theme and motifs are constantly transforming themselves and constitute the entire piece. Harmonically speaking, it is maybe the last work of Webern where tonal harmony can be heard, even if it is very expanded. The Schönberg school also referred to this stadium as floating or suspended tonality. That means that every harmony in the piece has a relationship to a tonal center, but the center is not clear and never or almost never heard. It is not really present, but only floating somewhere in the musical space. At some point, Webern but also Schönberg and others realized that this tonal center was not necessary anymore. The chords could just exist for their sound quality, the tones stand in relationship to one another without needing a tonal center as an orienting point. This was the decisive step into atonal music. The period after which this change had occurred is referred to as the free atonal or expressionistic phase. In this period, Schönberg and some of his students, notably Webern, wrote atonal music that had no real rules. The harmony was free, the forms often exploratory, and the motivic and thematic structure very complex. It was a very exciting time during which these composers pushed the musical tradition to a breaking point and had to discover how their musical language should evolve and what expressive doors they had opened. They were not really bound to anything and their creativity was at their high point in my opinion. Webern entered this period with his songs Opus 3 and 4. You can clearly hear that in the very first seconds of the first song of Opus 3.
Dies ist ein Lied für dich allein.
The dissonant chords are free, they don't follow any traditional harmonic rule. Schoenberg referred to what happened harmonically during the free atonal period as the emancipation of the dissonance. Traditionally, dissonances needed to resolve to consonances. They were just passing states. Now they became just as valid as consonances and part of the beautiful harmonies of these pieces. In some of the texts of the songs in Opus 3 and 4, including the ones he wrote but ended up not integrating in the final cycles, one can recognize the painful theme of these pieces. As Webern himself told his friend Alban Berg in a letter of 1912, with the exception of the violin pieces and some of the orchestra pieces, all of my compositions from the Passacaglia on relate to the death of my mother. So to everybody who says that Webern was an unemotional mathematical composer or something, he wasn't. Schoenberg, Webern and Berg were very clear about their intention in music. They composed to fulfill an inner need to express themselves, express emotions, ideas and states of mind they could only express through music. Now this brings us directly to the work I want to present in this video. The next work after the two song cycles was Opus 5, the 5 movements for string quartet of 1909. I will talk about it more in the next part of the video, but what's important for now is that with the songs Opus 3 and 4, a new period had begun for Webern. The real breakthrough, however, is more evident in the string quartet Opus 5. Webern's music became freer in every aspect. The harmonies and melodies were unbound, the forms became more individual. He used unusual instrumental techniques to create new colorful sounds, and the pieces became always shorter and more concentrated. The endpoint of this evolution was attained with the 3 little pieces for cello and piano Opus 11 from 1914. Webern's music had become aphoristic, some pieces lasting only a few seconds. It was mostly very quiet, extremely delicate and highly expressive. In the works from that period, every second is filled with intensity. But Webern couldn't continue in this direction. The philosopher Adorno, who was close to the Schoenberg school, said about these works, their continuation would have been the sigh alone. This aphoristic style was also used by Schoenberg and Berg, but Webern was the closest to this type of expression. It's interesting to see that these composers came from the Germanic Romantic tradition, admired Brahms, Wagner, Strauss, and above all Mahler, who wrote his extensive and massive symphonies during their lifetime. They revered him very much and saw themselves as the ones continuing the Germanic musical tradition he stood for, but their music evolved in a drastically opposite direction. There are worlds between the extremely lengthy, full and rich symphonies of Mahler and the fragile, momentary miniatures of Webern, or for example the last of Schoenberg's 6 little piano pieces Opus 19, which he actually wrote when he heard about Mahler's death. The Viennese school, and Webern most of all, condensed the passionate and lyrical romantic musical expression into a few seconds. That's why when you listen to these short pieces of Webern, or at least when I listen to them, it feels really intense, because every moment is extremely charged. Now I will simplify very much, but after Opus 11, Webern started to write a lot of eccentric vocal music. Later he started using the 12-tone method that Schoenberg had invented. Webern elaborated this method of composing and created very complex, strictly constructed and subtle instrumental pieces that were full of counterpoint and delicate nuances. I really like many of these pieces from Webern's middle and late period, but in general they speak less to me than earlier ones. Often the music feels a bit too controlled, cooler and somewhat self-restraining to me, especially in some of the later works. I prefer the earlier pieces of Webern or of the Viennese school in general. I love the free eight-tonal phase in which their music was free, wild, experimental, extremely direct and powerful. Their expression was unchained in a sense. You really sense the exploration of new artistic territory through the music. And this is the period to which we will return now, talking about the 5 movements for String Quartet Opus 5. So Opus 5 was written in 1909 and is right at the beginning of this fascinating free atonal phase of Webern. And I just quickly want to mention that the beginning of the 20th century was a very exciting time in Vienna, not only for music but for all arts. Many important developments happened in literature, painting and architecture, as well as philosophy or psychology. Painters who changed the art world as radically as the Viennese school changed music are, for example, Klimt, Kokoschka and Schiele. Sometimes their exhibitions caused similar scandals as the concerts where music of the Viennese school was played. So in certain circles of Vienna there was definitely a certain atmosphere of change and radical transformations. Anyway, back to Webern. The String Quartet Opus 5 was a really important piece not only for Webern but for the Viennese school. It really marks a radical shift. To write a string quartet like that was unheard of. Later in his life, Webern even wrote an orchestral version of it, but I prefer the original version because I find it more intimate and fitting for this piece. As I said before, this composition is very concentrated and rather brief. It is atonal and melodically, motivically, rather fragmentary. Its rhythms and tempi are complex. It uses unusual playing techniques, extreme registers and dynamics. All of this combined creates a music that is very expressive, intense and new at the time, especially new for the string quartet, which has such a strong and long tradition. And still one can clearly see that there are some remains of that tradition in Webern's piece. First of all, the work is in 5 different movements, of which some could be associated with traditional string quartet movements that Haydn, Mozart or Beethoven used. In the classical string quartets, often the first movement was the most complex one and used the sonata form. Webern's first movement is in fact a complex opening. It's a very agitated and straightforward opener. Some musicologists see remains of the sonata form in it. I have my doubts about that, but what's reminiscent of the sonata form could perhaps be the contrast between 2 different themes and the variation of material of these. But I hear it more as a constant variation and combination of material presented in the exposition. Then, just like in many classical string quartets, the second movement of Weberns Opus 5 is a slow movement structured in an ABA form. It's like a tender, sorrowful song consisting of a melody wandering through the different instruments, accompanied by somber chords. Also similar to classical string quartets is the third movement of Webern. It's a fast, short, rhythmical and exciting movement comparable to a scherzo. Then there is the fourth movement, which is again a slow movement. It is a very delicate but intense and piercing movement, which we will discuss in detail in the next part of the video. And finally, the fifth movement, which is again a slow movement, so you can see that there is disproportionately more slow movements in this work, which goes against the classical tradition of string quartets, where there were usually more faster movements and only one slow movement. This tells you something about the overall expressive nature of the whole work, since slow movements tend to be tender, delicate, somber, melancholic and touching. Having three of those is telling. The fifth movement is again a very expressive and soft movement, but is a bit more complex than the previous slow movements. It uses and varies a lot of material from the previous movements and sort of reflects on everything that has happened during the quartet. It definitely isn't a typical grandiose classical finale, but instead Webern ends his work with intimate, introspective and very quiet music. Now let's quickly go back to the very beginning of the quartet to examine some important principles for the whole piece that are exposed immediately in the first seconds. The first principle is strong contrast. The second one is the use of different types of musical material, like basic elements of his musical language, comparable to different elements in painting. For example, lines, blocks, dots, various types of textures, shapes, and so on. So let me explain. Webern starts off with very strong gestures and untypical playing techniques. As you can see, he starts off in fortissimo and fortissimo. After a short rising motif played by the cello and the second violin, Webern uses pizzicati in high registers in the first violin and viola, and immediately follows with the playing technique called collegno, which means with the wood of the bow. This creates these hard wooden and short attacks right at the beginning. This is then quickly followed by a very fast and rhythmical linear passage in the first violin, played normally with the bow. It's accompanied by pizzicato chords in the other instruments. So the piece instantly starts off with strong contrasts between linear playing with the bow and the noisy short attacks. For me, this is like the contrasty combination of lines and dots or blocks on a painting. The motifs and lines played with the bow are lines, the short pizzicati and wooden staccatos are dots and blocks. What's also important is the very fast change of dynamic. Already in the first 3 bars we went from fortissimo to pianissimo in a matter of seconds. So there is another strong contrast right there. In bar 4, Webern uses an untypical playing technique again. All 4 instruments play tremoli sul ponticello, which means near the bridge of the instrument. This creates this noisy, raspy, brighter texture. This is a new element which is kind of textural, like textures and surfaces in paintings. Right after that come pizzicati as a contrast again, followed by a chord played with the bow, contrasting again, then collegno in fortissimo, so contrast again, and finally these opening bars end with yet another rather special playing technique at the time, the flageolet, which are these very high, light and quiet tones. Here in pianissimo, so again totally contrasting with the fortissimo of the preceding chord. So as you see and hear, we have different combinations of basic musical elements, lines, blocks, dots, textures, and of course these can be blended together. For example, the motifs played near the bridge and with tremolo have a textural quality to them, but also form a short horizontal line. Or the chord played with the bow in bar 5 has a block quality to it, but is also held for a certain amount of time, unlike the pizzicato chord read before, which almost immediately fades after its attack. So this could be a short, thick line if we continue our analogy with painting. You could think of a painting by Kandinsky to visualize the types of basic elements I mean. I think these 2 principles are important for the whole piece and help understand it better. We will find the strong contrasts and basic musical elements in all the other movements as well. Now let's look closely at the 4th movement, which is just so intense and really breathtaking in my opinion. First, let's listen to it completely, since it's so short. So first of all, as you heard, this gripping movement is very short. It's only 1 page long, but is strikingly concentrated and much stronger than you would maybe accept from such a little piece. It's very slow. Webern writes sehr langsam, eighth notes equals 58. In the whole string quartet work, it is situated right after the rapid third movement and creates contrast. For me, it is the moment of highest intensity in the whole piece, although there isn't really a second that isn't intense. The whole movement is extremely quiet and delicate. All the instruments use mutes, which dampen the sound. The dynamics range from pianissimo to pianissimo, and Webern writes indications such as so zart als möglich, as soft or tender as possible. In addition to that, he uses many sounds which are very weak and fragile, such as playing near the bridge or the flageolets at the end. The movement is clearly structured in an A-B-A form, so quite a traditional form in which there is an opening section A, then a contrasting middle section B, and then again section A prime, often slightly varied. You can often recognize the different parts in Webern's pieces by looking at the tempo indications. Here you can see that at the end of a part there is a ritardando until the next part begins. They are also often separated by rests. In this particular movement there is also a specific gesture returning at the end of each section. You can see that the different parts get shorter and shorter. Section A is 6 bars long, section B 4 bars, and section A prime 3 bars. So Webern heightens the concentration in the section A prime. In fact, section A prime is half the length of section A. We will see how Webern does that later. Roughly speaking, in this piece, the contrast between section A and B lies in the contrast between movement and stasis. In both outer sections, there is much more dynamism and motion than in the middle section, where basically everything stands still. Now let's get into more detail, focusing on one section at a time. I would say that the first section A can be divided into two smaller parts. For me, the first 2 bars are a sort of introduction to the bars 3 to 6, in which the real motion begins. That doesn't mean that one part is more important than the other. The opening bars are crucial in setting the tone of the movement. Webern immediately plunges you into this very intense atmosphere. Let's look at how he does that. So this opening is in pianissimo, and all the instruments use mutes to make the sound even more quiet. It's really at the edge of silence. Just looking at the score, you can recognize that Webern works again with these different basic elements I talked about. The tremoli in the violins being a texture, the low single notes by the cello being some sort of thick, short lines, the very short motif in the viola being a thin, little, ascending line, and the last pizzicato of the violins being multiple dots or some sort of block. Let's examine that closely now. We have a sort of mini pedal tone in the cello with this repeated E flat. This is interesting because using pedal tones in introductions is quite a traditional thing to do. One of many very famous examples is the opening of Brahms' First Symphony. Webern condenses that into 2 bars. Above that pedal tone, the 2 violins play these very fragile tremoli near the bridge, which creates this frail texture. The chords played by the violins are dissonant chords built upon fourths and fifths. Oftentimes the chords used in early atonal music are based on these intervals because composers avoided chords based on thirds, since they create harmonies associated with tonal music. Now, these two first chords almost consist of the same notes in different dispositions. Note that only the highest notes of the chords change. Notably, the E natural becomes F sharp, so the upper voice rises a major second. And remember the second chord, which will be important later. It is based on a perfect fourth, a tritone, and a perfect fifth. Underneath that lies the E flat of the cello, which is a sixth below the lowest notes of the second violin. After the second tremolo, the viola actually imitates the first violin and plays this little rising major second motif from E natural to F sharp. This is really the most basic motif imaginable, but in this context it is very expressive. It follows these insubstantial tremoli and the single weak E flat in the cello, and is a first sign of life, so to say. The barely moving chords in the violins and the pedal point in the cello are static. The motif in the viola moves and has a clear direction. Webern even writes a little crescendo and decrescendo for this motif. Now finally, this introduction ends with a pizzicato chord by the two violins over the held note by the cello. This chord is very quiet and has a dry sound, especially in the high register of the first violin. The chord is actually the same as the beginning chord, so during these two bars the violins changed only one note, going from one chord to another and then back again. This last pizzicato chord, with its hard sound quality and very short resonance, clearly marks the ending of the introduction. This is reinforced by the tempo indication, zögernd, hesitant, and the decrescendo in the viola, plus the pauses and the tempo indication in the next bar. So in these two opening bars you find again the principles Webern uses for the whole movement and even the whole piece. Firstly, there is the principle of combination and contrast between different types of basic musical elements. Here it is a combination of textures, chords, held single notes, short dry notes and small lines. These categories obviously meld together sometimes. For example, the opening chord is of course a chord, but also has a textural quality to it because of the playing technique used. And I want to add that in this kind of music, the playing technique and the sound color is as important or even more important than the pitches. For example, the shivery sound quality of the pianissimo tremoli played near the bridge, in contrast to the dry and short-lived sound of the pizzicati. These two elements sound completely different, although they consist of the same pitches, they are the same chord. Then secondly, we already have a hint of the principle of contrast between stasis and movement in these opening bars. The little motif in the viola being the trace of movement in this static environment. These two principles are essential for everything that follows. Now let's continue and look at the next bars. Everything is still very delicate and quiet. Furthermore, these bars are more polyphonic than the previous ones. The different voices interact with each other more distinctly. After a short rest, the violin plays this falling arpeggio, and this arpeggio is actually the chord we heard before. It is bowed near the bridge, so we have this fragile, brighter and noisier sound quality with more overtones again. Actually, most of the pieces played in this manner. This arpeggio is imitated by the second violin and then by the cello, always transposed down. This kind of imitation of motifs going through different instruments is very typical for string quartet writing. The succession of these arpeggios create this clear falling movement. The viola repeats the little rising motif of bar 2 and thus creates a minimal counter movement. It slightly stands out because of its sound color too, since it is not played near the bridge in contrast to the arpeggio of the first violin. The cello plays this falling tritone before imitating the violins. Through the corresponding chords in the violins and the repetition of the viola, you can clearly see that these bars are connected to the opening bars. This is interesting in terms of perception. Webern uses very little and rather simple material and changes only a few things rather than starting out with lots of different things that immediately change completely. This facilitates the listening and orientation of the listener and guides the focus on certain aspects of the music. For example, in this case, since the chords stay the same, the listener can focus more on the different playing techniques, the sound colors, the movement, and the imitation. Or since the viola motif is repeated, one can focus more on the changing of its surrounding and how it changes with it. Now let's move on. After this falling gesture, the first violin starts playing a short melody which is immediately imitated by the cello. The arc of the melody is quite traditional, with this little suspension at the end, reinforced by the ritardando. While the violin and the cello entangle their melodies, the viola plays an accompanying voice. It consists again of a simple rising second, this time a minor second from F sharp falling back down again. Thus the violin, the viola and the cello end with a falling minor second, a rather dark gesture. After the cello has finished playing the melody, the second violin plays an unexpected rising gesture. This gesture creates contrast in that its direction is clearly rising in opposition to the mostly falling movement of the previous bars. It also contains more notes than previous motifs, is faster, and slightly contrasts in sound color because it is played normally and not near the bridge like most sounds we heard before. Last but not least, it contrasts harmonically. As I said, the chords were mostly based on fourths and fifths. This particular gesture, which could be seen as an arpeggiated chord, contains thirds and seconds, which gives it a different harmonic color. This rising gesture marks the end of the first section A, and we will see how Webern repeatedly uses it at the ending of each section, almost like a weak signal of some kind. It's like the music would softly disappear in the air. Now, in these last 4 bars we discussed, there were fewer different types of musical elements and sound colors. They consisted mostly of horizontal lines played near the bridge, and the action took place mostly through directionality and polyphony. What's important is that there was constant movement going on. This changes in the middle section B. Now, in an ABA form, the middle section B should normally contrast with section A. This is also the case in Weberns piece, but it's rather subtle. Many things are similar in both sections. It's all still very quiet and slow, there are no new playing techniques, and there are even similar melodic ideas. But how does Webern create the contrast then? The essence of the contrast between the two sections here is the opposition between movement and stasis. So, one of the main principles of this piece I mentioned before. This middle section is almost completely static and therefore contrasts with the preceding part, which was full of motion. It also has a completely different texture. Section A consisted of polyphonic movement, mainly based on lines. If we look at the first bars of this middle section, we can observe that it consists of three different elements. We have two held notes in the cello and second violin. We have a repeated pizzicato pattern in the viola and a melody in the first violin. Now, if I use my analogy of painting again, in this section the held notes are like two larger brushes of paint, which are more of a background texture, especially because of the playing techniques of the instruments. The second violin plays near the bridge and the cello plays a flageolet, so we have these two very subtle, noisy, complex and fragile sounds that create a background. Then the viola pizzicati are like little dots forming a repeating pattern that also falls more into the background. And finally, the violin melody is a beautiful line above all that. So this texture is very different from the textures in section A. Mainly the constant pizzicato of the viola and the thin held notes of the cello and second violin create that different type of musical texture. Now we can examine this a bit more. The pedal point of the cello can actually be connected to the short pedal point in the introduction of the movement. This time it is of course longer and reinforced by the second violin. The repeated pattern of the viola is actually an augmented triad, a triad often used by atonal composers because of its ambiguous characteristics. Important here is that it is structured in major thirds. This is a change from the mostly fourth and fifth based chords in section A, so this is another difference between the two sections. The melody of the first violin is also quite static in that it has a very narrow range and moves back and forth all the time. It goes down, then down and up again, so it doesn't really go somewhere. It is a bit similar to the melody we heard in section A, but here the melody is much more prominent than earlier. It is bowed normally and stands out from the background. This was not the case for the melodies in section A. They were entangled, and because they were played near the bridge, they sounded fragile. At the end of the melodic phrase we have a ritardando. The pizzicato pattern gets lost and the held notes disappear. Everything fades away. This indicates the end of this middle section, which is again marked by the beautiful rising gesture we already encountered before. This time it is played slower by the viola. The intervallic structure is exactly the same, only transposed down. Through the slowing down and the lower and different sound quality of the viola, it gets even more expressive this time. It is warmer and seems more like a melodic figure rather than an arpeggiated chord. And this is true for every appearance of this gesture, but I'll add that just the moments where suddenly an instrument is playing completely alone after passages where the whole string quartet was playing have a special expressive quality to them. Especially in this context, with this sound world, these quiet dynamics and so on. But this is true for any string quartet or even any ensemble music actually. Now, this rising gesture leads to the final section of the movement. In an ABA form, the last section should be more or less a reprise of the first one. If we look at Weberns' piece, at first glance, these two sections don't seem so similar. The last section is much shorter and seems less polyphonic and horizontal than the first section. It is much more concentrated, and in fact Webern managed to fit almost everything of section A into these last three bars. Let's examine the different elements in this last section now. The second violin and the viola play the first segment of the main melody of section A. The cello joins and imitates them just a brief moment later. So, just as in section A we have this polyphonic passage, but here at the end it is very condensed. It is reinforced by the second violin and viola playing the melody together in octaves. The first violin now plays the accompanying voice the viola played in section A, so already you see that the roles of the instruments have changed. This time it is played in flageolets, so it's very high and delicate and has more of a textural quality to it. After the melodic fragment has ended, the cello, viola and second violin play a pizzicato chord, similar to the pizzicato chord in the second bar. This time it is much lower and has a stronger and warmer sound quality. But the chord is actually the same chord used for the tremoli and the arpeggios before, transposed down of course. In this last section, Webern limits himself to only one statement of this chord. Lastly, there is of course the rising gesture played by the second violin again. It is the highest version of the gesture and is played near the bridge for the first time. So it really is the most fragile and delicate appearance of this gesture. Once more, we can see that Webern combines different types of basic musical elements here. We have the melodic lines, the more textural part of the first violin, then this chord which is like a block or an agglomerate of dots, and finally this last thin rising line. It ends this absolutely beautiful, intense and tender movement. The music that was already so quiet and at the brink of silence all the time seems to finally dissolve in the air. I'm always reminded of this solitary gesture in this movement when I listen to the piece The Viola in My Life by Morton Feldman, who was a New Yorker composer greatly impacted by Webern's music. So I think that's enough for this short but very expressive movement. We saw how Webern used different types of basic musical elements and combined them in various ways to create very clear, colorful and gripping music. We observed that contrasts play a crucial role in his music. These are obtained by changes of the musical fabric, dynamics, playing techniques, gestures, harmony, etc. The most crucial contrast created by all these changes together is the contrast between movement and stasis. This is not only crucial for Webern's music, but is maybe the essence of almost every kind of music. Furthermore, we saw that Webern's music is very concentrated and always filled with intensity. No second is wasted. He would go on and write shorter and shorter pieces, bringing the condensation and concentration to a high point. One of his most concentrated pieces is actually the next string quartet piece he wrote, the 6 Bagatelles for String Quartet Opus 9. His teacher Schönberg said about them, "Consider what moderation is required to express oneself so briefly. Every glance can be extended into a poem, every sigh into a novel. But to express a novel in a single gesture, joy in a single indrawn breath, such concentration can only be present when there is a corresponding absence of self-indulgence. Finally, we can say that even if the musical result is very strong, the means are actually rather simple. The form is very clear, the differences between different types of musical material is quite clear, lines, textures, blocks or dots are easily identifiable, and therefore the differences between gestures, between foreground and background, between horizontal and vertical elements are rather straightforward. All the contrasts are quite evident, the polyphony is clear, the figures, gestures and motifs are simple. Webern uses just a few chords throughout the whole piece, and so on and so on. So everything is rather simple and clear, but the way Webern uses all of this is admirable. He knows exactly how to time, combine, oppose and vary things. This intense and touching little movement is just masterfully done. The 5 movements for String Quartet Opus 5 were groundbreaking for Webern. His music changed forever after this piece. It was crucial for his own musical development and therefore also influenced the evolution of Western classical music. Many composers after Webern were deeply influenced by his work. I mentioned Morton Feldman, but there's also Boulez, Stockhausen, Ligeti, Kotak and many more. Traces of his music can be seen even in today's music. So I hope I could bring you closer to Webern's music. Maybe my analysis will help you understand and appreciate his works more. Go listen to different recordings of this string quartet and of course to other pieces of his. If you have some questions or thoughts, please write a comment. I really like reading them. And of course like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Thanks for watching.